The desert stretched endlessly, golden sands rolling under the scorching sun. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes even the smallest sound echo like thunder. At a lonely gas station, a solitary figure stood beside a sleek motorcycle. Black leather jacket, gloves, dark sunglasses. The man seemed unbothered by the heat, unbothered by the world around him. This was Steven Seagal, calm, composed, and completely unshaken. 7 bikers roared into the station, engines growling like predators approaching prey. Dust swirled violently around their tires, kicking up sand in their path. They circled him, revving and laughing, confident in their numbers. To them, this was just another guy to intimidate, an easy target. The leader, a tall man with a scar across his cheek and a cocky smirk, stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "Looks like we found a movie hero," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. The others laughed, echoing his amusement, convinced that one man, alone and seemingly unarmed, could pose no threat. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Steven didn't move. He didn't react. Not a twitch of the eye, not a flinch of his hand. He simply adjusted his gloves slowly, deliberately, as if marking the moment. Calmness radiated from him, a quiet power that was palpable. Years of martial arts discipline had taught him patience. Not for show. Not for fame. But for moments like this, when a calm mind and controlled presence mattered far more than noise or aggression. The bikers began to circle closer, their confidence growing with each passing second. One of them nudged Steven's bike, another brushed against his shoulder. "Say something," one yelled, half challenge, half laugh. Steven remained still. His calm was unbroken. The sun beat down, the wind swirled, but not once did his focus waver. Every movement of the bikers, every glance and smirk, was recorded in his mind. He could see their assumptions, their overconfidence. They believed power was in numbers. He knew it was in control. Then the leader leaned closer, voice low and menacing. "You lost, old man?" A chuckle passed through the group, but it died quickly. There was something about Steven Seagal that shifted the energy, a subtle presence, almost magnetic, that made the boldest biker hesitate. They didn't see it yet, but their assumptions had already set the stage for a lesson in discipline, awareness, and respect. Steven had stopped at the gas station quietly, alone. The kind of solitude that allows the world to reveal itself, if one knows how to watch. He stood by his motorcycle, gloved hands resting lightly on the handlebars, scanning the surroundings with calm, precise eyes. The desert sun glared off the fuel pumps, but he barely noticed. His focus was elsewhere, always elsewhere, in the space between observation and action. The rumble of engines grew louder, breaking the silence like an approaching storm. 7 motorcycles kicked up sand as they rolled into the station, their riders laughing, boasting, and sizing him up. To anyone else it might have looked like a casual encounter. But Steven could feel the undercurrent, confidence born of numbers, arrogance dressed as bravado. The leader, a broad man with a scar slicing across his cheek, led the pack. He leaned slightly on his bike, surveying Steven as though evaluating a puzzle. "You lost, old man?" he sneered. His voice carried across the station, drawing attention from the other riders. They were expecting a reaction. Maybe a nervous glance. Maybe some defensiveness. But Steven remained calm, adjusting his gloves slowly, deliberately. Each movement was measured, intentional. He did not hurry. He did not overreact. His stillness was more powerful than any words or gestures they could muster. Years of Aikido training had drilled patience into him. Not patience for show, not patience to impress, but patience as a tool. In martial arts, every glance, every stance, every tiny shift in posture communicates more than words ever could. And he had learned to read those signs long before this moment. The bikers nudged closer. One of them bumped Steven's shoulder, another brushed his bike. Laughter rang out, rough and loud. "Say something," a rider yelled, testing him, baiting him. Steven's gaze never faltered. He took a breath, letting the tension settle over the scene like a slow tide. Every glance, every movement of the bikers was mentally recorded. Their body language screamed overconfidence. Their overeagerness revealed impatience. In that instant, Steven knew they underestimated him. They assumed his calm was weakness. They were wrong. The leader cracked his knuckles again, a subtle threat, but Steven didn't flinch. He stepped slightly closer to his bike, not as a threat, but as a quiet declaration of presence. Every detail mattered, how the bikers shifted under his gaze, the flicker of hesitation that passed unnoticed by the others, the subtle loss of cohesion among them. Steven's calm was not passive. It was active, a force in itself. It demanded attention without demanding action. The desert seemed to respond, the heat and dust settling around the tension like a spotlight on an invisible stage. 7 men thought they had the upper hand. A man alone, unarmed, silent. To them it seemed an easy challenge. But they were about to learn a lesson about perception, about the difference between noise and substance. Numbers can intimidate. But presence, discipline, and awareness are something far more difficult to command. For Steven, this moment was not about confrontation. It was about observation. It was about understanding who they were, what they assumed, and how easily arrogance could be reshaped without a single strike. The bikers closed in, engines idling low now, as if waiting for some reaction from the lone man. Dust swirled around their boots and tires, carried by the faint desert wind. Laughter and chatter filled the air, but beneath it was an undercurrent of expectation, the anticipation of a reaction they believed inevitable. One of the riders nudged Steven's bike with a boot. A sharp clang echoed, metallic against metal. Another casually bumped his shoulder, testing boundaries. "Say something," someone jeered loud enough for all 7 to hear. But Steven remained unmoved. No facial twitch, no verbal reply, no defensive gesture. He simply adjusted his gloves again, slowly, deliberately. Each motion communicated calmness and awareness, though the bikers could not yet understand why it unsettled them. The leader stepped closer, cracking his knuckles once more, trying to assert dominance. "Looks like we got ourselves a quiet one," he muttered, half smirk, half threat. Yet Steven didn't respond. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, standing taller without moving aggressively. The air seemed to change around him. What had been light teasing and mockery now carried tension, hesitation, doubt. The bikers, previously brimming with confidence, began to notice something, an invisible boundary Steven had created. His calmness was magnetic. It was almost impossible to describe, but it made their arrogance feel fragile. The louder their engines, the smaller they felt. The bravest gestures now seemed clumsy, uncertain. The leader furrowed his brow, tilting his head. For the first time he hesitated. That hesitation spread like a ripple across the group. One rider's laugh faltered mid-chuckle. Another's smirk tightened, disappearing entirely. The sense of control they had relied upon vanished, replaced with uncertainty they could not articulate. Steven didn't speak. He didn't threaten. He didn't even raise his voice. Yet his presence communicated everything. It was confidence without aggression, authority without force. In that moment, the desert itself seemed to pause. The sun cast long shadows, the dust hung in the air, and even the distant rumble of engines seemed muted. The bikers realized that the numbers they trusted were meaningless if they underestimated the wrong person. One of them, a younger rider with nervous energy, glanced at his leader. Maybe he's not what we thought," he whispered, uncertain. The leader's smirk wavered. "Quiet doesn't mean weak," he muttered under his breath, almost to himself. And that was the shift. Perception had changed. Confidence became doubt. Arrogance became self-questioning. All without a single punch thrown, a single kick aimed, or a single threat escalated beyond words. Steven's stillness had become a lesson. His calmness had become a shield. And in the quiet of that moment, the bikers understood. They had misjudged him. Backhand index pointing right. Has someone ever underestimated you, and you proved them wrong simply by staying calm? The stage was set. What had begun as mockery, intimidation, and testing boundaries had evolved into tension, respect, and reflection. The desert waited silently as Steven's measured presence continued to speak louder than their noise, louder than their numbers, and louder than the assumptions they had carried into this encounter. This was not a victory in the conventional sense. There would be no fight, no humiliation, no physical confrontation. Yet already the bikers were learning something far more lasting. True strength is not in the force you apply, but in the composure you maintain. The desert heat pressed down, dust swirling faintly around the gas station. Silence now dominated, broken only by the faint hum of engines. The bikers had circled, nudged, and tested him, yet the lone man remained unshaken. Their arrogance had begun to waver, subtle cracks forming in their confident facade. Steven Seagal's black leather jacket glinted under the sun. His gloves, perfectly fitted, covered hands that had trained for decades to act with precision. Dark sunglasses concealed eyes that had seen much more than any of these riders could imagine. And yet he did not move aggressively. He did not raise his voice. He merely stood, radiating a presence that demanded acknowledgement without demanding action. "Enough," he said. "Calm, measured, steady." The word carried effortlessly, yet it carried weight far beyond its simplicity. The leader's smirk faltered, and the others instinctively took a small step back. No one could explain why, but the energy had shifted entirely. There was no fist thrown. There was no sudden motion. No chaos erupted. Instead, a subtle command had been given, a lesson conveyed entirely through presence and control. The bikers suddenly understood something they hadn't before. They had picked the wrong man. The leader's jaw tightened. He wanted to push to show that numbers still mattered. But even as he considered it, the young rider next to him whispered, maybe this isn't about who's bigger. The words barely left his lips, but they spread a quiet unease across the group. Steven's stance never wavered. Every inch of his posture communicated discipline, confidence, and awareness. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to act. His presence alone rewrote the assumptions that had brought these 7 men here in arrogance. The bikers glanced at each other, suddenly noticing the subtle cues they had missed. The way Steven's breathing was controlled. The quiet steadiness in his gaze. The careful, deliberate way he adjusted his gloves. Each gesture, ordinary on the surface, conveyed mastery. They weren't witnessing aggression. They were witnessing precision and composure. Do you see? Steven's voice cut through the quiet again, softer this time, but no less commanding. Discipline speaks louder than fists. Awareness is stronger than noise. Respect is earned, not demanded. The leader tried to maintain control, but his smirk had vanished entirely. Hesitation flickered across his eyes. He had expected an easy target, a weak man to mock. Instead, he faced someone who was entirely unshakable. Their previous assumptions, that numbers equaled power, crumbled in the presence of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering control over self, mind, and environment. The bikers instinctively backed away. Not out of fear of violence, but out of understanding. Respect had quietly replaced arrogance. The quietest voice had become the loudest lesson. Their earlier laughter felt hollow now, their confidence misguided. Steven didn't gloat. He didn't point or insult. He didn't raise a hand. Instead, he demonstrated the lesson effortlessly. That power lies in composure, that strength is often silent, and that misjudging someone can lead to consequences far greater than anticipated. In that moment, the desert seemed to hold its breath. The wind slowed. The sun bore down without distraction. And the bikers for the first time truly saw him, not as a celebrity, not as an actor, but as a man whose calmness alone had shifted the balance. The leader finally lowered his gaze, swallowing the words he had intended to throw at Seagal. For the first time he felt the weight of his misjudgment. 7 against 1, yet the numbers meant nothing. Steven's presence had spoken louder than any fist ever could. The lesson was clear. Arrogance collapses under discipline, and noise has no power over calm awareness. And just like that, the moment passed. The bikers, humbled and reflective, understood a truth far larger than themselves. Real power often comes quietly, subtly, and without a single act of aggression. The desert heat hung low, a stillness settling over the gas station like a weight. Dust clung to boots and tires, swirling faintly in the aftermath of engines that had once roared. The bikers had circled, tested, and underestimated. But now hesitation lingered in the air, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. Steven Seagal stood with perfect composure. His black leather jacket was uncreased, gloves snug. His dark sunglasses concealed eyes that had seen decades of discipline and confrontation, yet they radiated calm rather than threat. Every movement, deliberate and measured, carried an invisible authority. He hadn't struck, hadn't shouted, hadn't even gestured aggressively. And yet, the balance of power had shifted entirely. The leader, previously brimming with arrogance, now shifted his weight uneasily. He tried to assert dominance again. "You can't stop us all," he barked, though the words sounded hollow even to himself. Steven tilted his head slightly, voice steady, deliberate. "You don't see real strength," he said. "Numbers, noise, and intimidation don't define it. Discipline, awareness, and calmness do." The words settled over the bikers, heavier than any punch could have been. The younger rider, who had been testing boundaries moments ago, now glanced at his leader, wide-eyed. He doesn't even need to fight us," he murmured. Exactly. That was the lesson. Real power is not in proving dominance with fists or weapons. Real power is in control, presence, and awareness. The bikers had assumed weakness where there was mastery, arrogance where there was patience, bravado where there was certainty. One biker, shaking slightly, whispered under his breath, You could have humiliated us." Steven's response was quiet, calm, and measured. "I didn't need to. Real strength is about teaching lessons without harm. About showing the consequences of assumptions without creating chaos." The words cut through their remaining bravado like the desert wind cutting across sand. He wasn't threatening them. He wasn't punishing them. He was simply demonstrating that misjudgment carries consequences, even without violence. The leader's scowl deepened as he realized the truth. Every movement he had made in arrogance, every mocking smirk and attempt at intimidation, had been carefully noted, mentally recorded, understood, and neutralized. The quietest man in the desert had turned their assumptions into reflection. Their confidence was now tempered by respect. Steven's calmness was more than presence. It was a mirror showing the bikers exactly what they had been: overconfident, impulsive, and blind to subtle power. The desert seemed to acknowledge this shift. The wind slowed, the dust settled. The harsh sun now illuminated not just the sand, but the reality of the lesson they had ignored. The young rider, glancing at his leader again, spoke softly. "Discipline, that's real strength." Steven didn't nod. He didn't smile. He didn't even look at him. He simply stood, allowing the realization to sink in naturally. The lesson needed no embellishment. It needed no spectacle. It needed only clarity, awareness, and presence. The leader finally lowered his gaze, swallowing his pride. Arrogance evaporated in the presence of someone who had mastered himself. The bikers had arrived with confidence rooted in numbers and noise. They would leave with humility rooted in understanding. "You assumed weakness," Steven said quietly, addressing the group. "You chose disrespect. You tested patience. You learned consequences. Without anyone being harmed." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of decades of experience. They weren't threats. They weren't lectures. They were truths observed in real time, truths that carried more impact than any physical confrontation could have. For a moment, the desert was silent again. The engines sat idling quietly, the bikers unsure what to do next. They had learned something unexpected. True strength does not require aggression. True power does not demand compliance. True respect is earned, not forced. Steven finally stepped toward his bike, lifting it upright effortlessly. Even this simple motion, executed with complete calm and precision, reinforced the lesson. No one had to be humiliated. No one had to be hurt. Yet understanding had been achieved and respect had been commanded. The bikers, once so certain, now looked at one another. Doubt, reflection, and humility had replaced their prior arrogance. Each man realized in his own way that discipline and awareness outweigh noise and intimidation. Steven paused, glancing once over his shoulder at the group, silent but commanding. The lesson was clear. Power exists in control, in preparation, and in quiet mastery of self. Numbers can never replace discipline. Noise can never replace presence. And arrogance always collapses when faced with awareness. The desert stretched endlessly, golden and still. The lesson had been delivered, silently, without conflict, without chaos, without harm. And in that stillness, the bikers had learned something far more lasting than any victory could have taught them. The desert sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sand and asphalt of the quiet gas station. The 7 bikers had circled, tested, and underestimated Steven Seagal, only to find themselves confronted not by fists or weapons, but by a presence more powerful than any of them could comprehend. The air was still now, heavy with the understanding that assumptions had consequences. Steven stepped back from the group, his hands lightly brushing the handlebars of his motorcycle. Every movement was deliberate, precise, and controlled. He had already made his point. The lesson was clear, the balance of power unshakably established. Yet the moment demanded one final, undeniable action: clarity of conclusion. The leader, once brimming with arrogance, now shifted uneasily, shuffling his boots in the sand. His gaze darted from Steven to his fellow riders. "So, what now?" he muttered almost to himself. Steven didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply adjusted his gloves one last time and said quietly, firmly, "No one needed to get hurt to understand a lesson. You chose disrespect. You assumed weakness. And now you've seen the consequences." Each word landed with weight, not through intimidation but through absolute clarity. The bikers understood. Their confidence had been tested and reshaped by a single calm man who required nothing but his discipline to make them reconsider everything they thought they knew about strength. The young rider, glancing nervously at his leader, whispered, We didn't see it coming." "Exactly," Steven replied, voice calm and unshaken. "Numbers, noise, and arrogance can make you feel powerful. But real strength is measured in awareness, control, and patience. It doesn't need to show itself with fists or weapons. It shows itself by maintaining composure when tested, by guiding outcomes without chaos." A quiet tension settled over the group. Each biker began to reflect, not on the challenge they had tried to impose, but on their own assumptions, actions, and the lessons they had just been given. What they had thought would be an easy display of bravado had become a moment of self-reflection they couldn't ignore. Steven moved deliberately toward his motorcycle. He lifted it upright effortlessly, a smooth, controlled motion that underscored everything he had just conveyed. The bikers watched, mesmerized by the combination of calm strength and precision. Every action, every gesture, carried the quiet authority of someone who had mastered himself, and in doing so, commanded the respect of others without confrontation. The leader, swallowing hard, finally exhaled. "We misjudged you," he admitted, the words heavy but honest. His group nodded, recognizing the truth they could no longer deny. Their assumptions had been challenged, and now humility replaced arrogance. Steven mounted his bike, engine purring to life in smooth, controlled harmony with the desert stillness. He paused briefly, looking back at the 7 bikers. Not with anger. Not with triumph. But with the subtle reminder that true strength had been demonstrated without harm, without humiliation, and without aggression. The young rider muttered quietly, We learned something today." "Yes," Steven said, voice calm as the wind around them. "You've learned that discipline lasts longer than noise. Awareness is stronger than numbers. And respect cannot be forced, it must be earned." With that, he accelerated gently, sand trailing behind him in a thin cloud, leaving the bikers to reflect. They had entered with confidence, expecting a display of dominance. They left with reflection, humility, and understanding. In the quiet that followed, the desert returned to stillness. The engines idled down. The lessons lingered in the minds of the 7 men. Arrogance collapses when faced with calm awareness, and assumptions of weakness can carry consequences far greater than anticipated. The encounter was over, but the impact remained. One man had taught 7 the value of composure, patience, and disciplined presence, without a single act of violence. He had shown that true power comes from mastery of self, not from displays of force. The desert stretched endlessly, quiet, golden, and still, a fitting backdrop for the lesson Steven had imparted. The bikers would remember this day not for conflict, but for the demonstration that strength is silent, power is composed, and respect is earned, not taken. The desert had returned to stillness. The sun cast long, warm shadows across the sand and asphalt, illuminating the quiet gas station. The 7 bikers, once brimming with confidence and bravado, now stood scattered, reflective, humbled by what had just occurred. They had come to assert dominance, to test their own sense of power against a man they assumed weak. But instead of confrontation, they had witnessed a demonstration of discipline, awareness, and quiet authority, qualities far more formidable than any display of force. Steven Seagal mounted his motorcycle, gloved hands gripping the handlebars with effortless precision. The engine purred softly, a controlled sound that seemed to harmonize with the calm of the desert. He paused briefly, surveying the group one last time. Not with anger, not with triumph, not with judgment, but with the subtle confidence of someone who had demonstrated true mastery without ever raising a hand. The bikers watched him, silence falling over them like a weight. The leader, once so arrogant, now lowered his gaze. The younger riders, previously laughing and testing boundaries, stood still, absorbing the lesson without words. It wasn't fear that held them frozen, it was respect. A respect born from witnessing strength expressed through composure rather than aggression, through awareness rather than numbers, and through calm rather than chaos. Steven's presence had spoken louder than any confrontation could. His calm, deliberate movements had conveyed a message far deeper than intimidation or bravado ever could. Control is power. Patience is strength. Awareness is influence. In moments like these, the lessons last longer than any victory. He slowly started the engine, the soft roar harmonizing with the desert wind. Sand drifted behind him as he began to move, leaving a thin trail that marked the passage of someone who had rewritten the assumptions of those who had challenged him. The bikers stood in silence, realizing that the world they thought they controlled was not dictated by noise or numbers, but by those who understood themselves. The leader stepped forward, voice quieter now, almost unrecognizable from the bravado that had dominated moments ago. "We misjudged you," he admitted. His group nodded, a collective understanding dawning. They had assumed weakness where there was mastery, arrogance where there was patience, and chaos where there was discipline. They had been wrong. And they had learned it without a single punch, without a single threat escalating beyond words. Steven paused at the edge of the station, glancing back over his shoulder. His voice carried across the still air, calm, deliberate, commanding attention without demanding it. Respect is earned, not forced. Strength is shown in control, not in chaos. And arrogance collapses when faced with awareness and preparation. The bikers absorbed the words, each reflecting in his own mind. One rider muttered quietly, almost to himself, "Discipline, that's the real power." "Yes," Steven said, voice steady and unwavering. "And it's available to anyone willing to cultivate it. True strength does not require harm. True influence does not demand force. You've learned a lesson today, not through fear but through observation." The desert stretched endlessly around them, golden and still. The moment had passed, yet its impact lingered, like a shadow stretching long into the evening. The bikers would remember this encounter not for confrontation, not for conflict, not for chaos, but for the quiet lesson in mastery, composure, and true authority. As Steven rode off, dust trailing behind him in a thin, controlled cloud, the bikers remained humbled and reflective. They had come with assumptions of power, seeking dominance over someone they believed weak. They left with understanding, humility, and a newfound respect for strength expressed without aggression. The lesson was clear: true power is calm. True strength is control. Arrogance collapses when faced with preparation. The encounter was not about victory in a traditional sense. No one was harmed. No one was humiliated. But respect had been earned, quietly, deliberately, and permanently. In the stillness that followed, the bikers began to shift. Conversations were quiet, reflective. They spoke not of revenge, not of bravado, but of what they had observed. Each realized that their previous assumptions, that numbers, noise, and intimidation could define strength, had been completely overturned. For the viewers watching this story unfold, the lesson extends beyond the desert. How often do we underestimate someone based on appearances? How often do we equate aggression with strength? How often do we forget that calm, preparation, and awareness can outlast chaos, loudness, and impatience? Steven Seagal's quiet demonstration in the desert is a reminder that discipline lasts longer than noise, presence outweighs numbers, and composure commands respect. Speech balloon comment below. Thumbs up like if respect matters more than numbers. Repeat button share with someone who underestimates calm, quiet people. As the sun dipped lower, the desert returned to silence. Yet the lesson remained, etched in memory like tire tracks in the sand. Strength is not shown through force, but through mastery of self. Respect is not taken but earned, and calmness often speaks louder than conflict ever could. And with that, Steven Seagal disappeared down the endless stretch of desert road, leaving behind not fear but clarity, not chaos, but understanding, and a lesson that would last far longer than the moment itself.